My name is Logan Cross. I'm the chair of the Sierra Club of Northeast Florida. I'll be facilitating the event tonight. Diane Battle will be monitoring the chat for questions, and she will pose them at the end of the session rather than pose them during the session. And then we'll just have a kind of an open conversation at the end and go from there. Now, one thing that I want to say at the outset, the Sierra Club of Northeast Florida is getting ready to launch a campaign called Renew Jax. The purpose of the campaign is to try to get the city of Jacksonville to commit to operating on 100% renewable energy by 2050. That's a pretty big lift, but we think that the stars have aligned to the point that we can make it happen. So I want you to keep an eye out for information related to that Renew Jax campaign and possibly look for ways to get involved and help us out with that campaign. Turn it over to Diane to do the introduction of Captain Morley. So go ahead, Diane.
I'm a member of the St. Johns County Democratic Caucus, along with Nana and maybe some of the rest of you. But every month I participate in a monthly meeting as much as I can to keep us informed on what's going on. And John Pilecki, he brings along some excellent speakers, and last month was no exception in Captain Morley. I had just done an article. I'm the editor for the Sierra Club Century magazine here. And I found something in the big Sierra Club magazine about recycling, and a very eye-opening article. You know, who recycles your recycling? So I try to make a contribution to every month's publication of our newsletter. And so I picked this one, and I found a lot of other reputable organizations that verified the things that the Sierra Club indicated. So, you know, when I listened to Adam's presentation last month, I was pleased, surprised, not so pleased at the facts, but what Adam said, and Adam has been an owner of a recycling business in St. Johns County and St. Augustine in particular, and he's a lifelong resident of St. Augustine, and he's been involved in a lot of environmental activities and volunteer work. So he's seen it from both sides. But everything he said kind of tracked with exactly what I was reading and what I wrote about in the article 2 months prior. So I thought that with our Publix plastic bags, no more Publix plastic bags campaign that we're holding, as well as the fact that Jacksonville just last month finally got back its recycling services. And during the time that they were sort of wrestling with the big bins and trying to bring their recycling to the pickup locations, there were a number of not so pretty truths that emerged. And so we're here to kind of revisit what we've started to learn more than once, is that recycling is a business. And as a business, it's not doing so well. So Adam will give you his perspective on where the problems are today. And I hope that you won't be too depressed after you hear this, but you know, that's our responsibility. If we're stewards of the environment, we have to learn what's going on. So here is Captain Adam Morley, and I'll just let him tell you what he gets to tell you. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane, for the introduction, and Logan for hosting this evening. I am Captain Adam Morley, again, lifelong resident here in Northeast Florida, St. Johns County. A little bit about my background. I was in ecotourism. I started a recycling company in 2008 and then sold it in 2015. I sit on the board of the Florida Wildlife Federation as well. I had started the litter getter program, the successful litter getter program, which is now run by the Kansas River Keeper. And I have been an advocate in a lot of the environmental issues over the years. And with that advocacy, I have noticed a evolution. As I get more information, I start to look at ways to solve the problems. I was a captain. I've been a captain for 20 something years now. What got me involved was seeing the waterways that I grew up on having a lot of plastic. The plastic pollution problem was growing greater and greater on my home waters. And like a lot of people, I thought that the solution, and we'll get to why I thought this in a little bit, but I thought the solution was recycling. If we just had more recycling, we have a solution for the plastic litter problem that we see, the plastic pollution problem that we are seeing globally. And the sad truth is that is not the solution. And I'm not going to say that I wasted a lot of my professional life and time and career in the recycling industry, but I am going to say that I learned a lot. And one of the biggest things is kind of heartbreaking and really hard for a lot of people to accept and digest. So I expect at the end of the meeting, there will be some questions to try to get a better understanding. And I do welcome the hard questions if you have any after the meeting. But the reality is that in my talk of talking trash about recycling, I'm really mostly talking about plastic. Not all recycling is bad, but plastic recycling is a myth. It's a scam. It's not working. And in my view and many others' views, it's part of the problem. And so we'll start with some of the psychology here. And I got out of recycling just in time because I started seeing a lot more data and studies showing that people who have access to recycling actually use and waste more resources, especially plastic, because they think that they are doing something good by recycling plastics or reusing and repurposing plastics. Unfortunately, that's not actually the case. The reality is that when it comes to plastics, putting plastic in that curbside bin does absolutely nothing. We're talking not even like 0.000 something percent to reduce the demand for raw virgin materials to make plastic. And the problem with that is that plastic is not getting recycled because it's not recyclable. We've been duped for the last 30 something years by who? The ones who actually produce the plastics, because they know that, like, they've got the studies, they've done the market research. They know that if the general population, the general public, knew and understood that the material that was being put out there wasn't actually recyclable, that people would start feeling guilty for using it and use less of it. So there are, and for decades now, have been these campaigns, these recycling campaigns that are pretty much solely funded by the plastic producers to convince people that if you're recycling your plastic, you're doing good. You don't have to worry about the problem. Unfortunately, the reality is that it's not working, and we're starting to kind of come to terms with that slowly but surely. The plastic is not recyclable because of a few things. One, there's too many different types of plastic. And on a molecular level, each time that plastic goes through the recycling loop, it actually breaks down on the molecular level. And those plastic molecules, the strands, get shorter and shorter, and they're no longer able to bond to each other. And therefore, they're no longer able to make a viable product that consumers are going to have trust in and care to purchase. And so you'll see, it contains this much recycled plastic. Oftentimes that's just industrial recycled stuff. It's not post-consumer. And we have a lot of issues in the recycling stream, but it really starts at the waste collection. So we've kind of got this idea in our heads from a lot of the campaigns over the years that the litter that we see is coming from individuals that are intentionally littering. That's not actually the case. The majority of litter that we find here locally and even globally is coming from the industrial scale of trying to properly manage our waste. So I think it's 40 something plus thousand tons of plastic. 40 million tons of plastic is produced each year. Less than 9%. And those numbers are old, the 9%. The new numbers, I believe, are probably closer to the 3 to 5% actually get recycled at least once. And now with China and Asia no longer accepting our materials, those numbers are very low. The amount of trash that's ending up in the waterway is coming from the waste hauling industry. If you look at a lot of our county parks, a lot of the beaches, if you follow any of the garbage trucks, and I've got lots of videos of me following garbage trucks and even recycling trucks during collection day, you follow them over a bridge and you can just watch the trash blowing out. I got into, I'm not going to call it an internet argument, but I got into a discussion with somebody online about where a lot of this waste is coming from. And I explained to them about the waste hauling and how much is blowing out. And they disagreed. It wasn't but maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago that same person came back to me on social media with a video and actually said, "I'm sorry I argued with you. You actually know what you're talking about. Here's a video. I was behind a garbage truck and showed a video of a bunch of trash blowing out of the back of the recycling truck." So people are starting to understand where the problem really lies. The producers want people, based on their campaigns, to think that it's a personal responsibility not to litter. But the truth is, litter or trash has changed over the last 30 years. It's no longer the heavier, more dense materials. It's more lightweight plastics that are harder to manage. And from there, we lose, I mentioned how much actually gets recycled. We lose more than twice the amount that actually gets recycled to the environment through our poor management practices. So we lose 15% of that 40 million tons of plastic a year to the environment. That means that we're losing it to the oceans, we're losing it to the roadsides. We're just losing track of it. It's not ending up where it needs to end up. Now, what happens to plastic once it enters into the environment, especially the marine environment? We've now documented a good portion of that process. It photodegrades. Plastic ends up in the marine environment. It photodegrades, meaning the sun and the salt break it down into smaller and smaller little pieces of plastic. It doesn't biodegrade, it photodegrades, which means it breaks up into smaller pieces of plastic. Those pieces of plastic actually act like a sponge and they absorb the PCBs, DDTs, heavy metals, and carcinogenic properties. They have endocrine disruptors from the point of production. And all of this is ending up in these tiny little microplastics where we have now documented plankton, the base of the food web, consuming these microplastics and those toxins entering into the food web all the way to the top of the food chain. So smaller organisms get eaten by larger organisms, and all of those toxins bioaccumulate or biomagnify into those top of the food web species, and then we eat those. The average American diet right now consists of, they say, almost a credit card's volume worth of plastic every week. So it's in the air we breathe, it's in the water we drink, it's in the food we eat. Plastic has really infiltrated every part of the planet at this point. And it's kind of scary because we don't really know the long-term effects of it yet, but we're starting to understand that all of these carcinogens, all of these toxins that are ending up in our food through the plastic photodegradation process and re-entry into the food web, we are starting to make some substantial links to health issues that in the long run are probably going to be quite problematic. Now, back to the recycling side of it. Recycling isn't what a lot of the public thinks it is. What recycling actually is very different than what the public understands it to be. Recycling is a market-driven industry, meaning that these are commodities being collected and sold. If there is no value to the commodity being collected, or if it is cheaper to get it via another source, that's going to mean that product's not being purchased. So these plastics have such a low value and to start with, and are even cheaper to produce using raw virgin materials. So a lot of the plastics that you see that do boast how much recycled plastic they used in their product, it's a form of greenwashing. They know that people want to use more environmentally friendly products, and so they will use that. It costs them a little bit more, but it's not actually doing anything to slow the flow of plastics into society, into the environment. And the public is starting to catch on to that. We're starting to see more and more communities, more and more municipalities stopping the recycling programs because they no longer have an end user for these products. There are a lot of companies that have just stopped, and by companies, I mean end users. Those are the ones who are going to reprocess and pelletize the plastics and bring it to market. They've just stopped because it's no longer profitable. In order for this system in our society, in order for recycling to work, somebody has to make money all along the way. This is not a charity. This is not we want to do this because it's good for the environment. It's always going to be, we are doing this because it's profiting in some way along the line. I started the recycling company that I had with the idea that recycling was the solution because that's what we had been told. And my entire life, most adults' entire lives, recycling was what we were told to do to be part of the solution. And so I started a recycling company, grew it, and then I started noticing that what was happening was matching up with the data. People who had access to recycling were now producing more trash than they first were, because when I first started providing recycling service to the individuals who didn't have recycling, I could see their consumer habits change over time of providing them the service, where it switched from less plastics, less materials, to more materials and more plastics that they were putting in their containers. And that really kind of hit home. So I decided that I was going to start moving towards advocacy and start talking about the flaws with the recycling industry. And the flaw is that it is very misleading. It's telling people that recycle plastic and you're helping, but that's not the case. With other materials, other commodities, it is the case. There are materials that make sense to recycle both environmentally and economically. Those are the materials that should be included in curbside recycling. Plastic, I no longer believe should be part of our municipal recycling system or collection service, because the energy and the resources it takes to collect a material that no longer has a market, and the only market that really exists, it doesn't have much of a market, and the only market that exists is a market that's taking advantage of people's willingness to be environmentally or sustainable, but are unaware that the whole process is not actually working. To back up to the 50s, when plastic first started becoming hitting the market, I should say. What first happened when they introduced plastic to the market is it was rejected. And that's because coming out of World War I, World War II, the population at the time was so accustomed to saving and rationing resources and putting everything they could towards war efforts that throwing things away was just against the grain at the time. It was something that they were not willing to accept. And the oil industries, they understood this. And so they launched the recycling campaigns that these materials are recyclable, even though there was no infrastructure and there's nothing to show that this was actually recyclable. And it's not infinitely recyclable. Even the highest grade plastic, again, can only go through the loop a couple times before it starts to break down on the molecular level, in which case you're just speeding up that degradation process. You have all these microplastics that you then have to somehow deal with, which are often ending up in the environment anyway. So that's a little bit of the history of how we got to where we were. We've been duped by the oil and the gas industries that have sold us via these campaigns that all we have to do is recycle the plastics, and we'll be doing okay. They did that because they didn't want you to focus on the first two R's, which is reduce and then reuse. That's even evolved a little bit to modern times where it's refuse and just stay away from it altogether. But they don't make profits that way. If you're not buying their product, that's not beneficial to them. If you're reusing their product, it's a little bit more beneficial than not using it. But if you just use and then dispose of, thinking that you're recycling and doing good, that benefits them the most. And so they knew that if they put all of their money and marketing into these recycling campaigns, that the masses would continue to use these materials, causing the problems that we're seeing today. Now, it wasn't just the plastic industry, the oil, petroleum industry. It was a very creative strategy, knowing that municipalities are going are going to listen to their population. So the industry marketed to the population and had the citizens put pressure on the municipalities to start providing these recycling programs. Because of that pressure from the citizens, they started adding these materials into the recycling, into the waste collection stream. You got to keep in mind that the waste haulers, their money is made off of the contracts with the municipalities. The way that it works is that the municipality puts it out to bid to the waste management, advanced disposal, Waste Pros, all of these companies, and they say, this contract for millions of dollars to collect trash, because you're a waste hauler, is contingent upon the requirement that you provide a recycling service as well, because that's what our citizenry wants. And so the waste haulers don't even really care about recycling. They care about those contracts, those multi-million-dollar contracts to collect waste. There's the argument of, oh, well, if they don't care, why are they spending millions and millions of dollars on building material recovery facilities or all these facilities with all the sorting such? Because it's smart business. You're getting these contracts, you're using the money from the contracts, you put it a little bit towards these facilities, and it's kind of offsetting the costs, but you're still getting those contracts by providing a recycling service of some sort. And that's how it kind of all works. The citizens push for recycling. We saw it in Jacksonville recently. They made the business decision to discontinue their recycling efforts. Unfortunately, they they didn't do a great job at rolling out that idea. And then they put the centralized locations that ended up getting trashed. And then they started getting trashed online for their poor attempts at recycling. And so all of this pressure came back onto the city of Jacksonville to start providing recycling again, when, in my opinion, what they should have done was put their efforts into educating their citizens on what's actually going on in the whole recycling industry and in the whole recycling universe. Because I've noticed once the information is getting out there, people are starting to understand and accept it a little bit more. Each time I give one of these talks, more and more ripples go out into the pond, and we start seeing more and more people making those decisions to avoid plastics again, which is what we're really aiming to do. Now, that's kind of a lot of information there. There's programs, and this is where it kind of goes into policy a little bit. There are programs that places like Publix will do. I usually get this question of like, well, what about the Publix containers in front of their stores? I bring my plastic bags back there. I bring my styrofoam egg cartons and such there. When I owned the recycling company, I went to a lot of the state's public stakeholder meetings on trying to achieve the state's goal of 75% recycling of the waste stream at the time. And what I learned in that time is that these large companies that are providing these anecdotal kind of programs are mostly doing that so that they have an argument when it comes to state policies being made on those state policies not being made. So rather than having to accept a policy to phase out plastic bags, Publix lobbyists use their program that they collect several thousand pounds of plastic. They use that as an argument of why policy is not necessary. State policies are not necessary to address these problems because they're doing their part, which, like, they're not doing their part. It's not even a fraction of the amount of what they're collecting isn't even a fraction of the amount of plastic that they are sending out into our communities. But those arguments work. Those arguments of, oh, we're trying, just give us more time, until everybody kind of forgets about it. And they do that with a lot of the plastics, the plastic bags, the styrofoam. You'll see these programs set up at these large corporate places, and those are really just programs to help their lobbyists prevent better policy being passed at the state level. And by better policy, there are a few ideas throughout the country, and especially in Europe, things like EPR, extended producer responsibility. And that's something that is likely to be our solution. We're seeing it be implemented and be very effective, because what EPR does, what extended producer responsibility does, is it takes the cost burden off of taxpayers and it puts it back on the producers. And what they've found in areas that they've implemented this is, as soon as the producers of these materials are held accountable or responsible for portions of the waste stream, they get their best minds on the project of, or the task of, reducing the amount of waste they're putting out there while maintaining their current profits. So they figure, if we're paying 10% of the cost of the waste stream, if we're able to reduce the overall cost of the waste stream, that means that 10% is going to be a lot less. And that's what they're going for, because that's better for the bottom line. So EPR, extended producer responsibility, is probably the the closest thing to a solution that we can find right now. And I encourage folks to take a look at that and also get engaged in the other potential solutions. Be careful of the greenwashing solutions, or the solutions that they sound good, they feel good on an emotional level, but at the end of the day, they're not really helping. A couple examples, and this is not to discredit any groups that have tried this to help others, but one of the things that was always kind of cringeworthy for me is a few of these organizations, they would collect all these plastic bags. And again, whenever this happens, it gives the industry more ammunition to hold back policy at the state level, at committee hearings on policies that might actually make a difference. So organizations were collecting these plastic bags, and then they were knitting them into sleeping mats for the homeless. That feels good. We want to do that. We want to help people. Unfortunately, that's not working, because we know what happens, as I explained earlier, what happens to plastic once it enters into the environment, where the homeless people are. These plastic mats are not being taken care of. Oftentimes they are, and I've done forced cleanups, and I've tried cleaning them up, but by that time they've become so photodegraded that I try to pick up these mats and they kind of just fall apart and disintegrate into little bits on the forest floor, because they weren't taking care of it. My argument was that they would probably have been better going to some secondhand stores and buying yoga mats rather than using all of this energy to knit these sleeping mats out of plastic bags, which ultimately became litter. So nobody ever really thinks about the end product of these repurposed things, because it feels so good to be doing that project and the concept of that project. My argument is that we need to be a little bit more thorough in our implementation of these projects, so that we're not giving the industry ammunition when they go to Tallahassee and say, you don't need to pass any policies to address this issue, because look at all of these organizations and us that are doing something. Add all of that up, and we're talking of less than 1% of the amount of plastic that's being sent out is being used for these well-intentioned projects. So all of that I'm going to kind of conclude on that. We've addressed the problem, plastic, how much of it's entering into the environment, why people are still trying to recycle plastics. It's because of these marketing campaigns from the plastic industry, these campaigns to promote recycling, because if you recycle, it continues to profit them. Talked about what happens when it enters into the marine environment. Talked about some solutions like EPR, extended producer responsibility. I am still a huge advocate for individual responsibility, personal responsibility. Do what you can. Talk to people, talk to businesses about what they can do to help everybody wean themselves off of plastics. But really, it's going to take policy. Policy is what got us here. It was policy and marketing campaigns that got us here. It's going to take policy change to move us away from the plastic pollution crisis that we are currently dealing with. With that said, I'll ask Diane if I left any points out from the environmental caucus that I spoke at that I may have left out of here that you'd like me to touch on. Otherwise, we'll open it up to some questions.
First of all, let me call on Barbara. Barbara Gubman. She's And I'm going to think about that a little bit, because I've been to a couple of presentations on, the environment, and I don't want to get you mixed up with somebody else that had some other solutions.
Okay, well, I'm game to hear about other solutions as well. That's what this is all about, is figuring out the solutions.
I'll see the floor to Barbara if you'd like, Barbara.
Yes.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. So I just want to re-clarify what we need to be advocating for is we want recycling, because we know that glass can readily be recycled. We know that cardboard and most papers, I'm just going to put that in quotes, can be recycled. So what we're advocating for is we want recycling, but we do not want to include any kind of plastic in our recycling. And my only concern with what I've heard you say this evening, which is great, is kind of negative about the word recycling, but actually we do want recycling, but we only want recycling of glass and paper because we know those can be recycled successfully. And we very emphatically do not want recycling of plastic of any kind, because even the tiny amount that can be recycled, it's just not worth getting everyone confused by 1 and 5 and not 2 and 3 and so forth. So I want to be sure that is the message. And then styrofoam, yes. I'm not really clear about styrofoam. It's a plastic, I think, but maybe you could speak to styrofoam.
Yes. So yes, good point, and I will clarify that all recycling isn't bad. It's the plastic recycling that we've been duped in, that I'm really focusing on. Again, recycling is a market-driven industry. Different regions, based on their proximity to markets and manufacturers that can use those commodities, is going to change. That's another one of the problems with recycling in general, is that you go out to the Pacific Northwest, and you have more production, and so they are actually there's a market there for the certain commodities that they can then produce their products out of. But you come down here where to Florida in the Southeast, where we don't have as much production, but we have a lot of we don't have much manufacturing, but we have plenty of waste production. It overwhelms the system, and then the waste haulers are not going to be able to make money off of that. So it gets really complicated in a lot of cases, because being a market-driven industry, depending on how close you are to the market, because you have to think there's a lot of transportation costs every mile, every time it changes hands, they have to be making money. Nobody's volunteering to do this. They have to be making money. And the farther away the market is for these commodities, the more valuable those commodities have to be in order for it to be worth a company's time to deal with. So yes, in this region, and I'm speaking just to this region because it's different everywhere, fibers, generally speaking, are good. That, like, quotations of most fibers, most papers are good. That's the corrugated cardboard, the newspaper, office paper, junk mail type stuff. The one thing that isn't really recyclable, but they're accepting, is paperboard. That's your cereal boxes and soda boxes type stuff. That, again, it goes back to policy and definitions. They're collecting that, and then they're burning it, and they're incinerating it and calling that recycling. They're really just collecting those commodities and then throwing it in a incinerator and burning it. And it produces a little bit of energy for them, but it's not my definition. It's not the general public's understanding of recycling. When they say recycling, they think that is going to be either melted down or slurried up and poured into a new product and a new product being made, not that it's being thrown in an incinerator to create electricity for a minute and then being toxic ash after that. So again, fibers are good. Metals, that's both aluminum cans and tin cans, are good. Glass, infinitely recyclable. It's a great material, even if it ends up in the environment, which we don't want it to, but if it ends up in the environment, it's an inert material. It's not really causing the same issues that plastic is causing. However, there's a caveat to this. There's not much value to glass. And so asking private companies to collect a material that weighs a lot and costs a lot to move and transport, to collect this material when it's still, and there's no value to it, and it's still cheaper to make it out of raw virgin material. That's a heavy lift. So we want glass recycling. I want glass recycling. However, I do understand that this region doesn't really have a glass, an end use for glass. When I owned the recycling company, there was an end user in Jacksonville. They only wanted brown glass, and that's because the recycling company, the end user, was owned by Anheuser-Busch. All their beers in brown bottles. So they were able to use, that was kind of an in-house recycling program. They would accept the other glass that I brought to them. They wouldn't pay me for it because there was no value to them. A lot of the glass recycling, again, it goes back to definitions of what we want glass recycling to be and what glass recycling actually is. A lot of times what happens with glass in the recycling stream is that it gets crushed up, processed, and then it gets brought to the landfill and is used as a landfill cover. And that's recycling based off of the state's definition. So even when glass is being collected and recycled and getting processed, getting crushed up, getting loaded into a truck, and then brought to the landfill to dump over the plastics to keep the plastics from flying out of the landfill.
Right when China decided that our recycling wasn't worth taking, whoever was in charge of recycling, the city of Jacksonville, wrote an opinion thing that was in the paper. And right, what she said, which I'd heard before, was everything has to be dry. So you've got your cat food can, and you need to rinse it and dry it before you put it in the recycling, because any paper that gets wet can't be recycled. So any wet paper is automatically going into the trash, not the recycling, which to me, if I take all the time to do that to the cat food can, my next door neighbor's not doing that. So what it sounded like was there was absolutely no point in recycling paper. It was just causing a problem. And at that point, I think it was $4 million. It was either $2 or $4 million. She said the city of Jacksonville was subsidizing the recycling because so much of what went in the recycling had to go into. Is it true that if paper gets wet, it has to be tossed out? And they were supposed to dry anything we put into the can.
So that's one of the that goes back to the waste haulers. They pushed for single stream recycling, and for many decades we were at dual stream recycling. That's where fibers were separated from the commingled containers. But in the infinite wisdom of the folks looking to increase their bottom line, they decided, hey, if we move to single stream recycling, that's where all of the containers or all of the commodities go into the same container, the same space in the truck, that they will increase participation. However, with that came a huge decrease in the usable materials because of the cross-contamination of the liquids from the containers getting the fibers wet. So yes, when they switched from dual stream recycling to single stream recycling, it started contaminating a lot of the papers, the glass that would break, the glass shards would get in with the paper. That causes a lot of problems. It reduced the market demand for recycled materials because that ultimately became trash. But it did increase recycling participation. And that's what they were excited about. The participation increased, but the volume of usable commodities decreased. They didn't care about that. They wanted the increased numbers of people participating because that looks better for them, and it's easier to hide the fact that those commodities are no longer being recycled. That's not really, like, the rest of it is not really accurate. The paper is going to get wet. It's fine. It's the other liquids, the other stuff that's more of the problem, because in order to recycle paper, it's actually supposed to be wet. It gets mixed up in a slurry, and the fibers are then poured out and turned into new paper products. But if it's mixed with grease and oil and other things that often come from the containers, it's a problem. But what I heard from your paraphrasing of the opinion piece in the editorial or whatnot in the newspaper, there were a lot of things that made it sound like there wasn't a lot of real quality information in that. They were just wanting to put something out there to kind of say something. But I based on your paraphrasing, I would not. I don't think I would agree much with that article, because you don't need to wash out your cans. You don't need to wash out your bottles. It's the commingling that's the problem. The fact that they bought into the single stream process from the waste haulers because it's cheaper for the waste haulers to collect it single stream, that was the real problem, not that people were rinsing their containers or not rinsing their containers.
I'm just going to make a couple comments because I'm in Duval County, and then I have a question. So, nobody mentioned cans, and I hope that cans are worth their weight. So if you want to tell us whether it's good to recycle cans, that would be good. But my question is, and I was always trying to get paper bags when I got my groceries because everybody said the plastic was not good. So then I heard something on TV that this man said that so much goes into the process of creating that paper bag that it's kind of a toss up, it's not one or the other. So what do you have to say about that?
All right. So I'll try to cover all of those points. Styrofoam is polystyrene. It is not recyclable because there's really no market for it. It's mostly air, so wasting a lot of resources in transporting a product that is 98% air is just a lose-lose proposition. So there's no real point to recycling it. The only program, and my company actually tried, we had a machine that actually ground it up and extruded it. It was a densifier. That just didn't work. The materials did not carry value to make it make sense. What a waste hauler collects and what collects as recycling says is acceptable in the recycling program and what actually gets recycled are very easily two different things. So just because you have a list from the waste hauler that says you can put these things in the blue bin doesn't mean that it's getting recycled. The waste haulers, the ones that are actually collecting your materials, are not recyclers. They're not recycling. They are simply the transporters of those commodities that bring it to a materials recovery facility where those materials are separated, sorted out, baled up, and then sent to processors for those specific materials, who then process this into supposedly a usable or product that they then sell on the market to companies that need that commodity to build their products. So just because they say cracker boxes and whatnot are allowed in the bin doesn't mean that they're getting recycled how you want. Just like if they say glass is allowed in the bin doesn't mean that it's getting recycled how you perceive it to be recycled. Paperboard, the cracker boxes, is getting burned for energy. The glass bottles are being crushed up and used as a landfill cover. If you want to accept that as recycling, that's fine, but that's how it works. What people understand recycling is very different than the reality. Cans, metals, like the aluminum cans, the metal cans, those are actually the most valuable materials that you can put in the recycling bin, and are the one thing that I can confidently say 99% of the time is actually getting recycled. Like it has value. To give you an idea, aluminum cans are priced by the pound, whereas plastic and all of the other materials are priced by the ton. Or you can bring a few pounds of recyclables to a scrap metal yard and aluminum cans to a scrap metal yard and get paid for those. You can't bring or 10,000 pounds of plastic to a facility and get paid for it, because that's not enough for them to even start talking money, because that's how little value there is in these plastics. Anything that's single use or has a short lifespan before disposal is not the greatest. Yes, there is a very large CO2 and environmental footprint and impact. There's no question there. My argument is that if the paper bags still end up in the environment, they're going to dissolve and biodegrade, whereas the plastic bags will have a cost associated with them long term, whether it's an environmental cost or the life of wildlife that gets tangled or ingests it. That is often what is left out of a lot of these calculations. It's usually the upfront production costs that people use to argue, oh, plastic is better because it's cheaper to make, it has a shorter environmental, it has a less CO2, like all of these arguments, but they don't factor in how much is actually entering into the environment and the costs associated with after its end use. So you just kind of have to make your choice on that one, but reusables are really the way to go. A nice reusable canvas bag or 6 will go a long way.
So I think the thing that I'm concerned about is that here in Duval County, we have got to persuade our city that recycling services are a valuable service and that we want them to be effective. And so I'm just trying to be sure. I don't disagree with all the points you've made about how things, we don't have much manufacturing in the Southeast, so certain things are going to be costly. But if we're going to persuade people that they need to use less and to recycle those things that can be recycled more, I think we've really got to focus on what can be recycled and what can't be. And I hear you about the crushed glass, but that's what the city wants to do. And I'm resisting the city crushing glass to put in a landfill, because we're going to fill the landfill up and then we're going to spend a lot of money in the future to try and create another landfill. We spent a lot of money creating the one we have right now, and if we fill it up with crushed glass, that doesn't seem like a good idea. So I think what I'm trying to have you clarify is glass can be recycled. It doesn't have to be crushed and put in the landfill. And it may cost us something, but it's worth spending the money to recycle it rather than putting it in a landfill, crushed or not. And maybe I could get your reaction to that, but I'm trying to simplify it so we have a case we can make in Duval County to keep recycling, recycle what can be recycled, and that includes glass, but not crushing it and putting it to fill up the landfill.
Yeah, I agree with that effort to actually turn those bottles back into bottles. That I'm with that. Now, crushing it is part of the process, regardless of what happens. Yeah. What usually ends up happening is that it's being used because there's no market for that material. There's no, like, they're collecting so much of it, and unless you're asking the municipality, and Flagler actually just started Flagler County just started, Flagler Beach, I should be more specific, just started moving in that direction of collecting the materials, collecting glass, and they are turning it into glass mulch, a decorative glass mulch for their citizens, and doing other things with it. But they're going to exhaust those outlets at a pretty quick rate. And you're asking the municipalities basically to go into business. I think the government can't just tell somebody that they have to start a glass recycling plant to take this material that they're collecting. You either have to do it or provide some sort of incentives to do it. You can't just start by collecting all of this material and having all of this material and then try to build a local industry or a market for that material. You've got to, there's a process that you've got to follow in order to get to that point. I'm all for glass recycling. I prefer it because the energy to recycle glass is much less than it is to produce it. It's not necessarily cheaper, but energy-wise, it's less energy to make and then glass bottles and containers out of recycled glass than it is out of raw virgin material. However, it's still cheaper to make it out of raw virgin material. So you have those kinds of obstacles to overcome. One thing that did come up in the caucus presentation that I did was, and I have been thinking about it more, a lot of times the efforts to encourage and push for more recycling, and then they're great efforts, and I would encourage them to look at possibly food waste recycling, composting. There's more value in that than focusing on plastics or possibly even glass in regions where it doesn't make economic sense. Because composting will always, food composting will always make sense, whereas the glass recycling may not, based on the region that you're in. And I'll leave it at that. So consider focusing some of the efforts on expanding or even creating a composting program in place of some of these other programs, if you're genuinely interested in doing what is most beneficial, environmentally speaking.
And I really want to thank Adam for giving us this presentation. We've had a couple of presentations on recycling, and I think what we have to do is take what information we're able to get from those and make some informed decisions here on our program.